Founders, have you ever felt stuck when it comes to growing your business? Maybe you've reached a plateau and it feels like you're doing all the right things, but just not seeing the results you expect. Let me give you a tip. Sometimes when you're in this situation, it's better to look back instead of forward. Look, it's easy to get caught up in the conventional wisdom of startup world, right? Work harder, put in more hours, dump more cash into ad spend. Just power your way through and eventually you'll break through the ceiling, right? Wrong. Look, being a successful entrepreneur is certainly an art, but that doesn't mean you can't take a scientific approach to building your venture. The good news, and sometimes the painful news, is that results don't lie. If you're taking the right steps in the right order, you will be rewarded with results. But if you skip a step or ignore a negative signal and keep charging ahead, you're just setting yourself up for failure. So how do you take a scientific approach to entrepreneurship? What are the steps you need to take, and more importantly, in what order to build your business? Let's take a look at the RevRoad Startup flowchart. The idea of this flowchart is that as a founder, you need to set aside your emotions and look at your startup as a scientific experiment. You ask a question, gather information, form a hypothesis, experiment and test, and then evaluate the results with intellectual honesty and determine what your next step should be. And by the way, intellectual honesty is a critical part of this framework. If you need a quick refresher on what it means to be intellectually honest, check out the link in the description for another video on that topic. All right, so let's dive in. The first question you need to ask is whether you have found an actual monetizable pain. Customer pain is the foundation of a successful startup. If you're not solving an actual problem or addressing a real need, abort, pivot. You've got to understand this. It doesn't matter how awesome you think your product or service is. If it doesn't address a monetizable pain, you have no business. Notice what the flowchart says. The answer to this question is only a yes when it's validated through testing. That means that you don't get to decide whether you found a monetizable pain. The market decides. Your job as a dispassionate seeker of truth is to go out into the wild and ask real potential customers what their pains are. You've got to venture outside the comfy realm of family and friends and seek the cold, hard truth by performing problem interviews. Now, doing a successful problem interview is a topic of its own, but essentially, if you spend half an hour interviewing a potential customer about their challenges and don't have 4 out of 5 people bringing up the problem you're trying to solve, well, odds are you're barking up the wrong tree. But on the other hand, if you keep talking to people in the wild and they are bringing up the problem on their own without much prompting from you, congrats. You get to move on to the next step. Now, a quick note before we move ahead. A good founder will celebrate just as much when they invalidate a hypothesis as they do when they validate one. If you put in the work to test an assumption and you discover that you are wrong, that's awesome. Okay, you just did what 99% of entrepreneurs can't do, which is admit that you were wrong. You should celebrate that you just avoided months or years of wasted money and effort chasing something that never would have worked. That's the great thing about this model. There is no failure. The only way to fail is to stop following the principles. So if you follow the principles, you'll always be successful, even if the success you reach isn't what you have been envisioning. Now, on to the next step. Let's assume you've gone out into the wild and the market has validated that there is a real monetizable pain for you to solve. The next question you need to ask yourself is there a substantial market? Is this an opportunity worth chasing? The answer to this question honestly will depend on your aspirations for your business. Do you have a unicorn or bust mentality? If so, you better have a tam, sam, som in the billions or tens of billions. Or maybe you're okay with a nice, humble, low 8-figure exit, and in that case, you just need to prove a tam, sam, som that starts in the hundreds of millions. But the point is that just because you found a monetizable pain opportunity, that doesn't guarantee a large enough market exists for you to achieve what you want from your venture. To answer this question, you've got to perform some market research to determine how many potential customers match the profile of the people who validated your pain hypothesis. And if you find that the market exists, charge ahead. If not, be intellectually honest and either abort or pivot. Next, we've determined that a real monetizable pain exists and that there is a substantial market available to us if we can solve that pain. Now, the question is, can we actually solve it? Now, to explain what I mean with this question, let's look at an extreme example. Let's assume the monetizable pain we've identified is time travel, right? I said it was going to be extreme. So I feel confident that if you went out into the wild to test the hypothesis that people would pay good money to go back in time or forward to the future, you'd find validation. And obviously there's a large enough market to support a business there. So now the question is, can you build a time machine? Now, again, this is an extreme example, but the principle carries over into things that you and I work on as entrepreneurs. At this stage, you have to be completely honest with yourself. Now that you know exactly what the problem is it possible to offer a solution? Now, the question here isn't, can you build the product you originally had in mind, but rather, now that I know what real needs exist in the market, can I build the thing that will address that need? Ask yourself, does the technology exist? Can you get access to the capital you'll need to build it? Can you assemble the right team to make it happen? Are you yourself capable of doing the lift? Now look, I realize it may sound like I'm giving kind of a demotivational speech here, but that's not my intent. I want founders to succeed, and I know that success often only happens when we really stretch ourselves and test the limits. But it's also critical to operate with intellectual honesty and recognize when it may be better to pivot and tackle a more achievable goal rather than persevere on a path that really has no light at the end of the tunnel. Now, you'll notice that the criteria to move on from this step is that we need to gain validation through testing. Well, what does that mean? It means developing some kind of virtual prototype and returning to the wild to test it with potential customers and get their reactions. It means getting pre-orders. It means having customers be so jazzed about what you're doing that they ask if they can invest. It means having industry experts weigh in to verify that you're on the right track. Here at RevRoad, we encourage all of our entrepreneurs to do this step following lean principles. And that just means that we don't actually build the product yet. We put together Figmas or a video with a virtual demonstration of the feature set, or we do a 3D print of a prototype for physical products. The point is that we spend a minimum amount of time and money to quickly put together a representation of the product so that the potential customers can look at it and validate it. All right, let's assume that we validated our virtual prototype through customer testing. And now it's time to move on to actually build the MVP, or minimum viable product. Now technically, I've combined a few steps here. At RevRoad, we help our entrepreneurs develop a minimum feature set. And we test it with customers, then we go through a cycle of quick and inexpensive iterations on the product, adding additional features and just constantly iterating based on customer feedback. And ultimately, we end up with our MVP. And now we're at the point where, honestly, it's impossible to hide. Either the product is going to land right in the customer strike zone, or it's not. Look, results or lack of results don't lie. At this point, you need to ask yourself, does my MVP successfully address the monetizable pain? Now, let's go back for a minute to my extreme example of building a time machine. You checked the first 3 boxes on the flowchart, and now it's a moment of truth. Does your time machine actually transport people through time? Can I pull a Marty McFly and actually time travel by using your product? Or does the machine just show me videos of the past and offer predictions of the future? Look, I know this is a ridiculous example, but it highlights something that so many entrepreneurs miss. The truth is that a lot of founders break down at this step without even realizing it. They succeed in finding an acute and unsolved pain in a really attractive market, and they charge ahead and they build a product that doesn't solve the customer pain in the way that the customer wants it solved. In other words, they're so blinded by their own opinion of the product that they ignore the total lack of product market fit. It's a simple test. Give your MVP to your customer and see if it scratches their itch. See if it makes their job to be done easier to do. See if they cry out in pain if you try to take it away. If you can't confidently say that you validated your MVP through customer testing, don't move on. Iterate on your MVP. Obsess over the customer's problem until your product solves it. If your customer is demanding time travel, don't think that you've succeeded just because you've created a farmer's almanac. Okay, let's say you check this box. Your MVP hit the sweet spot. Before moving on, I usually encourage founders to do a quick sanity check and just make sure it's possible to still build a business model that supports a solution you've come up with. You likely did this early on before you started wrestling with all these product issues, but there's a good chance it's fallen off your radar since then. So now that you know what the product is going to look like and you've presumably been through some early sales cycles, let's take a minute to revisit your business model. What you're looking for at this stage is simple. Can you generate more revenue than what it costs to generate that revenue? Is your customer lifetime value greater than your customer acquisition cost? And by the way, quick side note, a good metric here is to have your LTV at least 3 times your CAC, but obviously that varies by industry. In other words, you've proven that you can build a real time machine, but can you charge enough to rent it out to cover all your R&D and production and overhead costs? Don't be afraid to get help on this step, especially if you consider yourself a visionary or a product founder and business acumen isn't really your strong suit. Work with an advisor or take advantage of your MBA friends. Get some additional brains in the room to challenge your assumptions and make sure that there's a path to profitability. Okay, now here's where the rubber meets the road, and it's time to go to market. The question is now, have I identified a go-to-market strategy that remains within the confines of the business model? And this is validated through testing, which at this point is really just business operations. Are your marketing strategies filling the funnel and qualifying prospective customers? Are your sales efforts successfully converting those customers? And most importantly, are your customer acquisition efforts staying within the confines of that business model we just talked about? If your CAC, your customer acquisition cost, is out of control, then you've got to iterate on your go-to-market before moving on. Okay, finally, it's possible that you've identified a legitimate go-to-market strategy that has a clear path to profitability, but you and your team just aren't capable of executing it. This one's tough, but it also has the most cut and dry criteria for moving on, and that is results. That's it. Are you selling? Are you getting consistent month-over-month double-digit revenue growth? Are you seeing the hockey stick? If not, you've got to iterate on the way that you are executing your revenue acquisition. Now, the time has come. If you've checked all these boxes, you're done, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. Once you make it this far, you should feel proud, but you should not feel like you've arrived. Now it's time to work on crossing the chasm. This is a concept from Jeffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, and it's a subject, honestly, for a whole separate video. But the point is, there's still work to be done to bridge the gap between the customers you've successfully landed, who are likely what Jeffrey Moore calls innovators and early adopters, and the majority of the market where the real scale opportunity is. So there you have it. That is the RevRoad Startup flowchart. Now, the way to use this tool is to ask yourself, is my venture achieving the levels of success that I'm aiming for? And if the answer is no, take a look at this flowchart and ask yourself, honestly, where the breakdown occurred. Again, this is a scientific approach, and results don't lie. Either you can check each box and move on, or you can't. If you're stuck and you can't figure out why, prepare yourself emotionally, and then go ask yourself each of these questions. Here's what I've learned from working with dozens and dozens of entrepreneurs. Almost everyone assumes that the breakdown occurred in one of these final steps. I can't tell you how many times I've heard founders say something like, "Oh, now all we need is to get our marketing nailed down and we've got this." Or, "Man, if I just had someone help me build out my sales function, we'd go to the moon." Listen, in my real life experience working with real founders, I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, the breakdown has occurred way earlier in the process. Look, I get it. This is a tough pill to swallow. As entrepreneurs, we're tenacious, we're committed, we believe in our product, but we're also not the best at being intellectually honest. It is so painful to admit to ourselves that we might have been pulling all-nighters in the pursuit of something that will never bear fruit. But I'm telling you, if you're stuck and you can't figure out why, there's a very good chance that you are on the wrong path from the beginning. Here's what you need to do. Start at step 1 in this process and promise yourself that you will follow whatever truth you uncover. Move through these steps one at a time. Maybe you'll end up adjusting course just by a few degrees, and maybe you'll end up doing a complete 180 with a major pivot. Regardless of where it takes you, wouldn't you agree that you're better off pursuing real opportunity rather than chasing a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow that you're too committed to? Look, the worst thing that can happen is you spend some time validating everything you thought you already knew, and you end up in the same place you're in now, just with a lot more confidence. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Founders, if you're stuck, try a different approach. Be scientific. Be intellectually honest. Work your way through this flowchart, and I guarantee you'll come out the other side in a better position than you're in right now. You can do it. Good luck. Founders, thanks for checking out this RevRoad Startup flowchart. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to drop questions in the comments below and let us know your thoughts on the flowchart, or tell us if there's other topics you'd like to hear more about. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this.